I would not have done what Mike Pence did. I don't think that was the right approach. I specifically stand by what I said on the House floor, and I stand by my statement, which was there was unconstitutional overreach.
That was a hot mess.
T is back, yeah. To be clear, what Mike Pence did was his job in certifying the election and his constitutional duty.
Right. What does it tell you that we are now locked in some reality version of America's next top vice presidential
Well, pick? And I mean, that to me is what this comes down to, as Elise Stefanik is in the conversation to be vice president. And so what is before the voters is a choice, yes. Both Trump and Biden have their downsides. But what the Biden campaign is trying to stress is the downside to a potential Trump presidency is you put people in place that may change the fabric of our democracy. And again, you can say, well, I want that to happen, and therefore you might want to support a Trump ticket. But if you're concerned about what that could mean, then you might not want Trump to be in office because, quite frankly, that could put Elise Stefanik in position to make the types of decisions that she now is criticizing former Vice President Pence for making. It's a true decision, and I think sometimes it gets lost in some of the other side conversations that the risk of a Trump presidency is that Trump and his allies have said over and over again that certain decisions that Pence and others were praised for making on January 6th or the days leading up to January 6th, they would not have made.
Yeah, so which tells us that if you just take what we now know that Trump wants and you transport it back to January 6th, Elise Stefanik standing at that rostrum will produce a decidedly different opportunity in a moment for the country. And I think that's an important element to understand.
And I think that's part of, I would be interested to hear, okay, so you wouldn't have done what Pence did. What would you have done? Be specific, because a lot of people think that Pence could have done other things. Again, a lot of legal scholars believe Pence did the exact right thing, or constitutional scholars and things like that. But what would you have done different? And then let's back that out as to what would have been the outcome of these other decisions. Because, again, we could have been in a true constitutional and democratic crisis. I mean, January 6th was bad enough already. I say that as someone who was there when it happened. It was bad enough already, but we have the hindsight of not having to have lived out worse case scenarios on that day.
We are accustomed to Elise Stefanik and other Republicans' revisionism. That revisionism seems to be seeping into some segments of the American electorate. I'm going to pull up our new NBC News poll. It found 40% of voters now say Donald Trump's presidency was better than expected. I don't know what to make of that number.
Well, that is again, contextualizing and looking backwards fondly. And we see that voters do that. They tend to look back on a time that they were cursing real time, 10 years later, 8 years later, 5 years later, saying it was different. But in this case, it's a little bit more disturbing for me. And it really confirms for me something that I think is very important for people to understand. It's one thing to sit back and criticize Donald Trump and to go anti-MAGA. The most important thing you have to do right now is understand what's in front of you. You have to understand what they're saying and why they're saying it. And I think that 40% of voters now saying Donald Trump's presidency was better than what's really happening around them is part of the fog that Donald Trump has created, narratively speaking. And the elements that are within that fog are all the things that, we're kind of dealing with, the trials and this and that. How do we clear that fog is the question. How do we level up the conversation in reporting and discernment by those of us who are trying to, have that moonstruck moment, snap out of it.
Yeah, but also talking about, you travel with the president and the vice president. You go back to Georgia often and report about what is happening in Georgia. I also think maybe we need to talk about what is actually, to your point, Michael, what is happening in front of us. What the things that the president and vice president have been doing so that voters have a better understanding so they can make their decisions.
Yeah, I think also to the poll, to me, two things stand out. Number one, most voters had a really low expectation for the Trump presidency starting out. And so I think it makes sense that he had nowhere to go but up among a lot of voters when you look at how they look at his 4 years. But also, I do think, to Michael's point, people tend to think more fondly as former presidents are out of office. George W. Bush has benefited from that hindsight as well, even though, you know, in real time, he was criticized for a lot of his decision-making. Think of Hurricane Katrina and the weapons of mass destruction conversation. So that is, to me, the way we look at former presidents is one conversation. And if Trump, particularly if he remains a former president, he's always going to benefit from some of that hindsight. But to your point, Simone, the fact that he's not just a former president, he's a former president who wants to be president again. And we do have to be sober-minded and truthful about what that could mean.
What that could mean. And he said he'd be a dictator on day one. Tia Mitchell, thank you for coming to the table with us.